I am Michael Bennett. For 23 years, my life was tied to the deep trails of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I've seen it all. Misty dawns on the ridgelines, storms tearing the forest apart in the middle of the night. But it was the final months of my career that left the deepest mark on me. I could have kept doing this job for a few more years. Instead, I retired early. Not because of age, not because of health, but because of the truths I uncovered out there in the wilderness, truths too heavy to carry, and once you've seen them, there's no going back. I can still remember the beam of my flashlight trembling across wet rock walls, the wind pushing through narrow gaps in the mountains as I stepped deeper into places where human feet should never have gone, and that chilling realization that I wasn't just protecting a national park, but crossing into the territory of something that didn't belong to the civilized world. Cataloochee Valley. I used to call it the blind spot of the Smokies, a stretch of more than 150 square miles of untouched forest, so remote that most visitors had never even heard its name. The terrain there is brutal, sheer mountains rising like walls, ravines swallowing every ray of light, and old-growth trees woven together into a ceiling of green and black. By day, the sun barely filters down in thin strands, flickering on moss and fallen leaves. By night, the valley sinks into a darkness so thick that even a single leaf hitting the ground echoes like a whisper. Even for rangers, Cataloochee was the kind of place you only went in two situations: when a search team had no choice but to go after the missing, or during rare wildlife surveys. Nobody volunteered to patrol there, because the valley devoured every trace of human presence. I had grown used to the silence of the woods, but Cataloochee carried something different. It wasn't just quiet, it was watchful, as if the very air was holding on to each sound you made. And in that silence, I often felt it clearly. I was not the only one standing there. During those last years in the valley, I began to notice something wasn't right. The official numbers for missing persons were always smaller than what I knew to be true. Reports claimed only a handful of lost hikers each year, but out there on the ground, I found more abandoned camps, boots left behind, footprints cut off in the middle of dense forest. The searches themselves were strange too. Instead of widening the perimeter the way we were trained to, they ended quickly, confined to just a few days. More than once, when I suggested extending the sweep into certain areas, the response was always the same: too dangerous, not necessary. At night, when I sat alone in the ranger station, I would flip through the case files one by one. The dim glow of the fluorescent light fell across the red stamp that read, "Case closed," while my mind kept drifting back to the cold smoke that lingered over abandoned campsites deep in the forest. It always felt like there were two realities, one neat and tidy on paper, and another out there in the woods, where people vanished into the dark and no one wanted to speak of it. And from that gap, a suspicion grew inside me. Maybe someone didn't want the truth about Cataloochee Valley to ever be made public. The first case that truly shook me was Sarah Martinez. I remember her file clearly. A woman from Atlanta, more than 15 years of backcountry experience. She was well-prepared: tent, cooking gear, even emergency communication devices. Before entering the woods, she filed a detailed itinerary with the Park Service down to the very last day. When Sarah failed to return on schedule, I personally led the search team. We followed Boogerman Trail, step by step through heavy fog. Near dusk, the last rays of daylight slid across the treetops, and that's when we found her camp. At first glance, everything looked textbook. The tent was set up correctly, food was strung high to keep it safe from animals. But the longer I looked, the more uneasy I became. Her backpack had been opened, items scattered around the campsite, and yet, it wasn't chaos. Everything had been put back neatly, almost deliberately, as if someone had examined each piece of gear and then placed it back in its spot. The most disturbing part was her communication gear. Sarah's satellite beacon had been opened, and its internal components stripped clean. Her cell phone was shattered not from a fall, but as if it had been destroyed on purpose. I picked up a shard of plastic, and a chill ran down my spine. Around the edges of the campsite, the ground was damp with deep impressions. Bare footprints, dozens of them pressed into the soil. They came from every direction, converging at the very place where Sarah had pitched her tent. This was no accident. It wasn't the work of animals. It looked like a calculated ambush. From that moment on, I knew Sarah Martinez hadn't simply gotten lost. She had been taken by a hand that knew exactly what it was doing. I can still remember kneeling there, the slanting light of evening cutting across the mud. The footprints were clear. Long toes, narrow arches, pressed deep into the wet ground. And what froze me most was the pattern. They didn't come from one side. There were prints from the north, from the south, even from behind the campsite, all of them closing in, silently drawing a circle. I drew in a long breath. There was no doubt in my mind. This wasn't chance. This wasn't a lone wanderer stumbling across her camp. It was deliberate, organized. Someone or some group had moved in the dark and closed the trap without ever being seen. In that moment, the forest around me seemed to fall silent. The wind stopped. All I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. And I knew then, Sarah Martinez hadn't disappeared by accident. She had been targeted. Less than 3 weeks after Sarah's case, another report came in, this time from Round Bottom. The missing person was Jake Morrison, a local hunter. Unlike most visitors, Jake had grown up in these mountains. With over 20 years of experience, he didn't need maps or GPS to find his way. I found Jake's truck parked neatly at the trailhead, like he had just stepped away for a short hunt. Inside were a few personal items, arrow tips, some food, everything tidy, nothing out of place. But when I followed his trail into the woods, that sense of normalcy vanished almost immediately. For the first 2 miles, his boot prints showed steady, confident strides across damp soil, exactly what you'd expect from an experienced woodsman. Then suddenly, they stopped, not fading gradually the way they do when someone changes direction or steps onto harder ground. They just cut off, clean, as if Jake had been lifted off the earth. I stood there, surrounded by stillness. Shafts of daylight broke through the canopy in broken patches. The breeze carried the damp, earthy smell of rotting wood. There were no signs of struggle, no broken branches, no calls for help, just a cold emptiness where his steps ended. Deep down, I knew, a man like Jake doesn't just vanish like that. This wasn't someone getting lost. This was another hand at work, a script already written, waiting for him. While sweeping the area around Round Bottom, I came across something that froze my blood. Hidden among thick brush, barely noticeable unless you caught the angle just right, was a crude structure, a hunting blind. It had been built from rotting wood and camouflaged with leaves so well it blended into the forest floor. But from inside, it had a perfect line of sight to the trail Jake had taken. That wasn't coincidence. Someone had chosen this spot with precision, the way a sharpshooter picks a position. When I crawled inside, dim light filtered through gaps in the leaves, falling across a wooden post in the corner. Etched into it were markings at first glance just scratches, but when I shined my flashlight closer, I saw the truth. They were tallies, lines carved to track days, and the realization hit me like ice. The marks matched up perfectly with ranger patrol schedules. Every single line reflected the exact days we'd passed through that part of the forest. I sat there in the cramped blind, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks of the structure, and in that moment, I understood. Someone had been watching us for a very long time. Not just hikers, not just hunters, even rangers, like me, were under their eyes. When my flashlight swept across the far corner of the blind, I froze. It wasn't just camouflage in there. It was a collection. Old wallets, yellowed ID cards, crumpled hunting permits. Beside them lay folding knives, compasses, metal canteens, every item worn and scarred from use. I picked up one ID, brushed the dirt off the plastic, and stared into the face of a man who had never appeared in any ranger report. A man who had gone missing. And it wasn't just one. There were many, each arranged in small groups, laid out neatly like exhibits in some twisted museum, as if someone wanted to remember or show off their trophies. Some of the items dated back more than 5 years, which meant the disappearances in this area weren't new. They had been happening for a long time, systematically. We just hadn't dug deep enough to piece the pattern together. The air inside the blind grew heavy, suffocating, even as the wind still whistled through the trees outside. I sat frozen, listening to my own heartbeat hammer in my ears. It was clear. I wasn't standing in a random shelter. I was inside a hidden trophy room, built by hunters who didn't stalk animals. 23 years on the job had taught me one thing. Most missing persons in the forest leave telltale signs. The zigzag tracks of someone lost. The scattered belongings of someone panicking. I had seen dozens of cases like that, and could spot them instantly. But what I was seeing in Cataloochee Valley was nothing like that. Sarah Martinez hadn't run, she'd been surrounded. Jake Morrison hadn't gotten lost. His trail ended the moment he was being followed. And the personal items inside this blind weren't just left behind. They were proof. Evidence of deliberate intervention. I can still remember the chill creeping up my spine as I thought back on each scene. There was no chaos, no confusion, only precision. A script written in advance, carried out step by step, and I knew enough to recognize this wasn't the hand of nature. This was the hand of something else. I also knew that if I stuck to official channels, the truth would never surface. The reports would keep getting closed too quickly, the search grids drawn too small. So I made my decision. I started acting on my own. I used my ranger clearance to enter restricted areas, places even my colleagues rarely went. In my pack, along with food and weapons, I carried a detailed topo map, a marker, and a GPS unit. Every time I found something unusual, I marked it, noted it, then connected the dots. At first, I thought I was only tracing narrow game trails, but the deeper I went, the clearer it became. They weren't random at all. They connected into a network. Along these paths, I found the cold ashes of small fires, cut marks on tree trunks, and footprints, some belonging to boots, others bare. On my map, the red dots I marked began to take shape, scattered sites that were placed too deliberately to be coincidence. I sat alone under the shaky beam of my flashlight. The map spread across my knees, and realized I had crossed a line. This was no longer search and rescue. This was an investigation. And what I was tracking was a hidden community living in what I once believed was wilderness ruled only by animals. As the pattern formed, the truth became undeniable. This wasn't a handful of drifters hiding out in the woods. I was staring at an entire network of secret settlements. Each site was positioned with strategy. On ridges with wide views, at trail edges where travelers passed, or deep in valleys where daylight barely reached. All of them were connected by faint trails. At first glance, they looked like animal tracks, but when followed long enough, they revealed themselves as the backbone of a system. Along these routes, I found signs of watch posts. A bent branch, a pile of stones, or a lean-to, hidden cleverly in the brush, each one a signal or an observation point. From those spots, someone could watch every hiker who passed, while staying invisible themselves. I sat at one of those posts at dusk. The wind whispered through the canopy, sounding like voices. Fading sunlight filtered through the leaves in broken beams of gold. And in that moment, a chill ran through me. For years, my colleagues, countless visitors, and even I had all walked through this forest under their eyes, never knowing it. As I pushed deeper into the network, I came upon strange clearings hidden in the forest. Not campsites, not animal bedding grounds. They felt like holding areas, temporary stops, but not for travelers. At the base of a slope, I found rough wooden frames driven into the ground, with rope marks still etched into them. Nearby, a shallow pit that had been used for waste. On the tree trunks surrounding the clearing, deep scratches like human nails clawing in desperation. My chest tightened when I picked up a dented aluminum canteen lying next to a torn, weather-worn jacket. These weren't fresh. They bore the mark of time, proof that someone had been kept here long enough for their belongings to decay. I stood there as the forest darkened, the air pressing in. The silence carried with it an echo like cries once made here, absorbed and buried by the trees. And I knew with certainty this was where they held their captives, until a decision was made about their fate. I'll never forget the first time I stepped into the cave system deep in Cataloochee Valley. The entrance was hidden beneath vines and fallen trees, looking from the outside like nothing more than a shadowed hollow. But the moment I walked inside and swept my flashlight across the damp stone walls, a chill ran straight through my blood. On the walls, I saw maps drawn in charcoal and red clay. Not random markings, but detailed schematics of the park's trail systems. Next to them were symbols marking dates, and when I compared them, they matched perfectly with the official ranger patrol schedules. Deeper in, I found wooden racks propped against the rock, holding scraps of paper and old notebooks dangling by twine. They weren't meaningless notes. They recorded visitor details. When people entered the forest, how many were in each group, the routes they had registered. Everything cataloged with a cold, methodical precision, like administrative files, kept by an office that had no business existing here. The cave echoed with the slow drip of water, blending with the musty stench of stone and burnt wood. Standing there, I realized I wasn't inside a random hideout. I was in their command center, a place that proved this wasn't just scattered survivalists. This was a community, organized, long-standing, and studying us for years. As I pushed deeper, my flashlight quivered across the frozen stone. In a narrow passage, I saw hollows cut directly into the rock. They weren't natural formations. Someone had carved out cells. Inside, the evidence was undeniable. Rusted iron rings bolted into stone, broken chain links, circular wear marks on the floor, signs of people who had been restrained there for long stretches of time. In the corner of one cell, a shallow pit likely used as waste disposal. The air reeked of dampness mixed with something sour, sharp, like the stale breath of those who had once been trapped here. Then, the beam of my flashlight caught a glint of metal. I froze. A wristwatch corroded, its leather strap rotted to the edge of breaking. Next to it lay a torn backpack, inside a faded ID card, the issue date over a decade old. I stood motionless. These items were proof beyond argument. People had been held inside these stone chambers for years, and that reality was far more terrifying than anything nature could have created. I turned into another branch of the cave, where the space opened into a wide, shadowy chamber. My light swept across it, and my breath caught in my throat. In front of me were remains, human remains, piled together, arranged with intention. They weren't like animal carcasses left to decay. These skeletons had been processed, flesh and tissue stripped away. Some bones bore clean-cut marks sliced with practiced hands. Others had been coated with pine resin, as though preserved with crude but deliberate methods. It all pointed to one truth. What I was looking at wasn't random death. It was a system. I swept my light across the cave wall. Black scorch marks stained the stone, evidence of fires that had burned there many times before. On the floor, stones were arranged in a circle, and at the center, dark red stains remained, dried but unmistakable signs of rituals that had taken place long ago. The silence was so deep I could hear water dripping from the ceiling, each drop echoing like the slow heartbeat of something vast and hidden. The cold sank into my bones as I realized this wasn't just a place of confinement. It was a place of execution, and the marks around me proved that the violence here wasn't random. It was part of a practice that had existed for generations. When I finally stepped back from the cells and those haunted walls, I had to stop and steady myself. In 23 years on the job, I had seen desperate moments. Hikers who dropped their gear to lighten the load, victims of exhaustion collapsing from hunger, even rare cases where survival had pushed people into extreme measures. But what I found in Cataloochee Valley was something entirely different. This wasn't the chaos of desperate people clinging to life. It wasn't luck. It wasn't a small group fighting the elements. I was staring at a community with structure, with rituals, with a culture of its own, one built on the darkest foundation imaginable. Hunting humans as a way of existence. Every carved mark on wood, every clean slice on bone, every personal item displayed in hidden blinds, they all told the same story. This wasn't seen as a desperate act. To them, it was identity. It was a way of life. In the shadows of that valley, I understood I was no longer investigating disappearances. I had stumbled into a hidden civilization, warped and inverted, where human law had been replaced by a single rule. The strong hunt the weak, and those who vanished became part of their dark memory. I knew I had pushed too far, and eventually, that day came. On my final return to the caves to collect more evidence, I felt the unnatural silence of the forest pressing in. No birds calling from the canopy. No wind threading through the valley. Only a heavy emptiness, as if even nature was holding its breath. As I moved deeper into a narrow passage, my flashlight shaking against the rock, the first sound shattered the stillness, a branch snapping underfoot. I spun, and the darkness erupted with motion. They were there, surrounding me. Gaunt faces smeared with mud. In their hands, weapons of every kind. Sharpened wooden spears, crude axes, gleaming hunting knives. Even an old handgun clearly taken from others before me. The steel glinted in my beam, flashing once, then vanishing, like dozens of eyes watching from the dark. They moved in unison, the circle closing tight, silent but sure. All I could hear was my heartbeat pounding inside my chest. In that moment, the truth struck hard. I had been exposed. I was no longer the observer. I was the prey. From the very first moment, I knew the way they moved wasn't like drifters wandering without purpose. They closed in on me with the rhythm of a hunting pack. Every step measured, not a sound wasted. But behind that animal instinct was something far too familiar. I had trained in military environments, participated in exercises with professional units, and what I saw here made my chest tighten. The formations, the way they divided their angles of approach, the hand signals. These weren't random gestures. They carried the marks of tactical knowledge. A few in the shadows held their weapons like trained soldiers, stances firm, approaches chosen with precision. The thought hit me hard. Could former military or law enforcement have joined this community, bringing their expertise to train the others? As my flashlight swept across faces streaked with mud, I saw no panic in their eyes, only cold calculation. And in that instant, I understood I wasn't facing a group of wild people. I was staring down an organized unit, a hunting machine that had fused animal instinct with human tactics. The circle was closing. In that suffocating moment, I leaned on everything I'd learned in 23 years. I couldn't just run blind. There was only one path out, an advantage they didn't expect. I seized the instant when one of them shifted position. Sliding through a narrow gap in the rock wall, I bolted east toward a ranger trailhead. Few people outside the service even knew existed. Every step thundered in my ears like a drumbeat, branches tearing behind me as proof they were right on my heels. I yanked the emergency communicator from my belt and flipped the switch. The crackle of static filled the silence, faint, but enough to remind me I still had a lifeline to the outside world. It was the one thing they hadn't counted on. At last, after what felt like an endless sprint, I broke free of their circle. But the cost was clear. I had exposed everything. They had seen me, they had heard me, and they would wipe away every trace before anyone else could find it. When I returned, days later, with federal backup, the cave I had entered was empty. The maps, the notebooks, the grim evidence inside the cells, gone. All that remained were bare, cold stone walls, as if nothing had ever been there. After that, I filed my final report and handed in my retirement. Not because I wanted to leave, but because I knew there was nothing more I could do within the boundaries of the job. The evidence I brought back, the things I had seen with my own eyes, all of it was swallowed in silence. I never received any confirmation that the investigation went further, but I couldn't just let it go. I still follow the news, still track every new missing persons report that comes out of Appalachia, and I see the same patterns, the same repeating details that can't be ignored. Something is still happening in those deep woods, just like what I witnessed. I've reached out to families of some victims, giving them quiet, unofficial advice, places to avoid, signs to watch for. They listened, not because I'm still a ranger, but because I'm the only one willing to say out loud what the official reports always avoid. If there's one warning I can leave with anyone hearing this story, it's this. The greatest danger in the Appalachian wilderness isn't the bears, the cliffs, or the flash floods. The real threat comes from people, those who've abandoned society, live beyond the reach of law, and have turned the rest of us into prey. And when you hear the wind cutting through the trees or feel unseen eyes watching from the dark, trust your instincts, because you just might be right.
You're listening to Untold 365 Scary True Stories. If you enjoy this video, hit the like button, click subscribe, and comment the number 2 so we know you want more chilling stories.
I still remember that fourth morning vividly. The first light of day filtered through the dense canopy, scattering across the forest floor in broken shards, like splinters of glass. I sat outside my tent, scrolling through the images I had taken over the past few days. At first, everything looked normal. Towering hemlocks, a glittering creek, wildflowers blooming in bursts of color. But then, my heart froze. In the background of one frame behind the trunk of an old tree, in a patch of heavy shadow, there was a shape. A figure. I zoomed in. This wasn't just a random pattern of branches or a trick of shade. The outline was too straight, too symmetrical for nature to produce by accident. Still, I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just a visual illusion, light and shadow playing tricks on my eyes. But even as I flipped to the next photo, The faint silhouette clung to my mind like it was still standing right behind me. Uneasy now, I scrolled through the entire memory card, frame by frame. With each new photo, my pulse quickened. It wasn't just one image. In shot after shot taken miles apart, hours between them, the same figure appeared, sometimes peeking from behind a leaning tree, sometimes standing on the edge of a ridge, other times blurred in a veil of fog. The detail that sent ice through my veins was this. Every single time, the figure appeared at the edge of the frame. Never the center, never obvious, always just barely within view where the eye might skip over it, but the lens wouldn't lie. The posture, the placement, the distance from my camera, none of it felt random. It was as if someone knew exactly where I would stand, exactly how I would compose my shot. They had positioned themselves to appear only in fragments, just enough to be noticed later, never enough to be undeniable. As a professional photographer, I knew what that meant. To place yourself so precisely in the margins of a composition, you'd have to understand focal length, angles, and framing, which left me with one conclusion I couldn't shake. Whoever was out there knew photography. That thought alone made my skin crawl. I had come here to capture the untouched beauty of the forest, to create a record for science and conservation. But now I realized I might have become part of someone else's work of art. When I stopped on a series of shots from my very first day in the forest, my whole body went rigid. In a few of them, beyond that faint silhouette, there was a tiny glint of light. I zoomed in as far as my screen would allow. The faint reflection revealed something unmistakable. Rigid lines, a squared outline. It looked like a camera. I sat frozen. I wasn't the only one taking pictures. Somewhere out there, that figure had been lifting a lens toward me, quietly documenting my every move. The idea slammed into my chest. I'd spent my career making nature my subject, watching it from a distance through glass and steel. But now, I was the subject captured in frames I would never see. This wasn't just someone lingering in the background of my photos anymore. This was a two-way game. I was photographing the forest, while in the shadows, someone was photographing me. I remember the rush of panic rising in me, the instinct to pack everything up and get out of the woods immediately. But then the professional in me pushed back. If someone was really tracking me, if they were intentionally leaving traces in my images, then I could do the same. So I made a decision. Instead of running, I would turn the lens on the one who had made me the target. I mounted my longest telephoto lens, the kind I usually used for distant birds or elusive wildlife. I fell back on the skills I'd honed for years, holding my breath before pressing the shutter, waiting patiently behind cover, moving so slowly that the branches around me didn't stir. One thought pulsed in my head. If this was a game, I was going to flip the roles. I would stop being the prey and become the observer. 2 days later, after endless waiting, nerves stretched thin. The moment came. Late in the afternoon, the sun cut through the canopy in narrow beams. I crouched low behind a rotting log, telephoto lens locked on a break in the trees where I'd caught the faintest hint of movement. I pressed the shutter, one shot after another, the faint click sounding like my own pounding heartbeat. When I reviewed the images, my hands trembled. The blur was gone. For the first time, the face was clear, gaunt but alive. Long, matted hair, sun-blackened skin, and eyes deep, dark eyes catching just enough light to gleam as they stared straight into the lens, straight at me. In that instant, all thoughts of illusions dissolved. This wasn't a trick of light. This wasn't my imagination. I was not alone in these woods. Someone was here tracking me, step for step. In the sharper images, the details came into focus, and what I saw left me both stunned and unsettled. This person wasn't wearing anything that belonged to the modern world. Their body was wrapped in rough stitched animal hides, tied together with braided plant fibers, layered into a crude but functional garment. The colors blended perfectly with the canopy and forest floor, a camouflage crafted straight from nature itself. Their hair hung long and tangled, falling like a dark curtain around their face. Their skin was sun-blackened, weathered, and hardened like bark, scarred by years of wind, rain, blazing sun, and freezing nights. Nothing about them resembled a hiker or a lost traveler. Every detail spoke of a life lived entirely in the wild, cut off from society. Looking at those frames, I felt like I'd stumbled onto a fragment of history that had never been written, like a living human being preserved from another age, someone who belonged in archaeology, not in the present. I zoomed in on one particular shot. A shaft of light broke through the canopy, glinting off something in their hand. At first glance, it looked like a block of wood, but when I studied it closer, my stomach tightened. It was a camera, not any kind I'd ever seen in a store or magazine. This device was pieced together from rusted metal scraps, shards of broken glass, and a rough wooden frame. The joints were crude and exposed, but the lens was pointed outward as if it actually worked. In my field, I know how unforgiving photography equipment can be, a fraction of an error, and it won't function at all. Yet here, deep in a forest miles from civilization, someone had built a tool to capture images using nothing but salvage and whatever nature offered. That thought sent shivers racing across my skin. They weren't just watching me, they were preserving me, recording me, with a machine that should not even exist here. As I reviewed the sequence of photos, the chilling truth became clear. This wasn't some lost soul wandering the woods. This wasn't a ghostly trick of the shadows. This was a flesh and blood human, someone who had chosen, or been forced, to live outside society, yet had not abandoned intelligence. That handmade camera, the way they placed themselves at the margins of my frames, the deliberate movements designed never to reveal their full form, all of it pointed to a mind operating far beyond mere survival instinct. They weren't just hunting, building shelters, or enduring like a wild hermit. They were sustaining art, an active, creative gaze that belonged to civilization, yet thrived here in exile. And that thought froze me to the core. In a place I believed to be untouched wilderness, there was someone still creating. But their medium wasn't landscapes or wildlife. Their subject was me. When I studied the frames again, another detail struck me even harder. This person didn't look frail or worn down like a castaway. Their body was lean, strong, every movement controlled and steady, as if this way of life wasn't a struggle at all, but something they had mastered long ago. There were no signs of hunger, no staggering steps. On the contrary, their stride was steady, their gaze sharp, their entire body radiating the kind of strength that comes from consistent nourishment and survival skills honed over years. That meant they had a reliable food source, a way to find water, and knowledge of plants, hunting, or preserving supplies, skills that went far beyond the basics. In the shadows, I realized they weren't just surviving, they were thriving. And more than that, they knew how to remain invisible in a place I had assumed was ruled only by wild animals. In another sequence of shots, taken from a distance, one detail froze me harder than all the rest. The figure wasn't just standing there watching. They raised a hand, tilted their fingers, shifted their body slightly. It wasn't random movement, it was a signal. The gestures were short, precise, like a structured body language. I'd seen similar signs used by hunters, by rangers, by soldiers giving silent commands, and what I saw through my lens was the same. A chill ran down my spine as the realization sank in. I wasn't being followed by just one person. Somewhere beyond those layers of dark trees, there were others, silent, hidden, waiting for the cue to move. Suddenly, the forest around me felt smaller, suffocating. Through the lens, I only saw one figure, but in my gut, I knew I was being watched by many. The first 3 days in the forest had felt flawless. I woke to valleys blanketed in white mist, the first light of day dripping softly through centuries-old trees. My lens captured every detail, the moss-covered trunks of ancient hemlocks, rare wildflowers blooming between rocks, streams curling through the forest like ribbons of silver. I was so consumed by the work that I lost all sense of time, darting from one composition to the next. Each frame carried exactly what the magazine had asked for: untouched beauty, a call for conservation. My chest filled with a strange calm, convinced this assignment would be just another successful expedition, no different than the hundreds I had completed before. Looking back now, that piece feels like nothing more than a gentle prologue. Because even then, in those frames that I believed held only trees and water, something else was already there, silent, patient, waiting for me to notice. I had chosen to set camp in a natural clearing by a small creek. The water ran crystal clear, trickling over stones so clean you could see every pebble at the bottom. It felt like the perfect spot, a fresh water source, a breathtaking view, and most importantly, at least 8 miles from the nearest service road. When I first settled in, I felt relieved. No footprints, no litter, not a single tree showing signs of being cut. It was as if no human had stepped into this place for years. I pitched my tent, hung my supplies by the book, and finally sat back, breathing deep the cool, raw air of a forest I thought was mine alone. The only sounds then were the creek splashing against stone, birds calling from above, and the wind threading through the canopy. Together, they made the perfect soundtrack for a photographer who thrived on silence. I had no idea that sense of safety was nothing more than an illusion, a thin veil hiding the presence of unseen eyes watching from a distance. I've never taken wilderness safety lightly, and this trip was no exception. My pack held everything I thought I could possibly need. Over $30,000 worth of camera gear, lenses of every focal length, backup batteries, spare memory cards. Alongside that, I carried a satellite communicator, an emergency beacon, and survival gear that had gotten me through countless expeditions before. I had spent weeks alone in the backcountry of Canada, shot sandstorms in the African desert, and crossed icy ridges in Alaska with no one beside me. Compared to those extremes, I believed I was more than prepared for whatever Daniel Boone National Forest could throw my way. For the first few days, that confidence wrapped around me like armor. I told myself that as long as I had my skills and my gear, I was untouchable. But the photos I would uncover later tore that armor apart and forced me to accept a horrifying truth. No amount of preparation protects you when you become the subject being watched. In October 2022, I was handed the kind of assignment every nature photographer dreams of shooting for National Geographic. My task was to document the last remnants of old-growth forest in Daniel Boone National Forest, where centuries-old trees still stood untouched in valleys too remote for loggers to reach. The assignment would last 2 weeks, requiring me to camp in an area without trails, without official campsites. Everything there remained, as it had been for ages, raw and unmarked. This was my chance to bring people face to face with the fragile beauty of Appalachia, a treasure most would never see with their own eyes. When I first stepped into that forest, I thought I was simply creating an artful record of nature. But the deeper I went, the clearer it became. Just as I was documenting the wilderness, something in the shadows was documenting me. For 15 years, I had built my career around one passion, capturing nature's fleeting beauty before it disappeared. My photographs had been shown in international galleries, published in major outlets, and used as evidence in conservation campaigns. I'd tracked tigers in India, photographed melting ice in Greenland, and camped for weeks alone in Canada's wild forests. Each journey tested my endurance, but each also cemented my reputation as a photographer unafraid to go where most people would never dare. I had always believed my experience had prepared me for anything wild animals, brutal weather, the harsh realities of survival. But my time in Daniel Boone National Forest proved me wrong. None of my past expeditions had taught me how to face the one danger I never imagined, becoming the prey and being photographed. From the very beginning, I knew this trip would be different. My assignment was to spend 2 full weeks in the deep forest, documenting the last untouched ecosystem of Daniel Boone. No trails to follow, no official campsites to lean on. All I carried was my tent, my equipment, and the knowledge I'd gathered from hundreds of journeys before. Every step had to follow animal paths. Every night's rest was a gamble with absolute wilderness. I thought I was ready for solitude, but in a place I believed held only ancient trees and running water, I learned a truth I had never considered. I wasn't the only one observing. When I pieced everything together, the shadowed figures at the edge of my frames, the hand signals, the crude but working camera, I realized this wasn't just one stranger wandering alone. Every detail pointed to one chilling possibility, an entire hidden community living out here. They weren't just surviving off the land. They had preserved intelligence, art, and enough technical skill to rebuild tools long abandoned by modern society. That thought froze my spine. For years, I had used my camera to capture nature on the verge of disappearing. But this time, in the darkness of Appalachia, I had captured something that shouldn't exist at all. A hidden community, organized, patient, watching, and turning outsiders like me into their subject matter. And from that moment on, I understood. I wasn't just being followed. I had stepped into a photograph I would never control and might never even see. In the end, I came to a truth anyone entering these forests should know. Appalachia is not only home to towering trees, waterfalls, and valleys untouched by time. Buried deep within are communities that live outside society, people who have chosen a different existence, silent, deliberate, and always observing. I came here to photograph nature, but when I left, I carried something far more disturbing. The knowledge that there are eyes in the woods that never blink, hands holding crude cameras pointed back at us. And if you ever set foot in Appalachia, remember this: sometimes you're not the one capturing the scene. Sometimes you are the one being captured, stored in a secret collection, hidden deep in the shadows you'll never get to see. I still remember that afternoon when my family drove along winding mountain roads, completely alone, until we finally pulled up to the cabin that promised to be our perfect getaway. The last rays of sunlight slipped through the oak trees, glowing in fiery reds and yellows, spilling down onto a small wooden house tucked deep into the valley. The cabin was so spotless I could hardly believe it had been built back in the 1942. Every board, every window frame looked carefully preserved, holding on to its rustic charm while still feeling solid and safe. Just steps from the porch, a crystal-clear stream trickled by, catching the sunset in thousands of sparkling fragments like shattered glass. The sounds of the mountains wrapped around us, dry leaves rustling under the breeze, birds calling high above, and the distant echo of running water weaving through the silence. For the first time in months of city noise, I felt genuine peace settle over us. When I looked over at Lisa and our two kids, I saw their eyes light up, part excitement, part relief. And for me, someone who grew up in rural Tennessee, that moment only confirmed I'd made the right choice. This would be the perfect week for us to reconnect, cut off from screens, and experience the raw beauty of the Appalachians. But on Monday morning, everything changed. I stepped outside to check the car before we went hiking. The second I bent down, my stomach dropped. All 4 tires were completely flat, the rubber slashed cleanly, too precise to be an accident. I popped the hood, and the blood in my veins turned cold. Several engine components were missing, and the fuel line had been severed in a single, deliberate cut. The kind of work a skilled mechanic could do in silence overnight. No noise, no warning, no trace. But what shook me more than the sabotage was what someone had placed right on top of the hood. On one side sat bundles of fresh food, still carrying the scent of earth, a few rough pieces of clothing stitched from old fabric, and hand-carved tools with stone edges polished from long use. They were arranged neatly, like an invitation. Stay here, live like us. Next to them were items that clearly didn't belong to us: a child's worn-out backpack, a broken flashlight, and personal belongings rubbed smooth from countless touches. They were laid beside a folded map, hand-marked with trails leading out of the forest. The message was painfully clear: if you want to leave, walk out and keep the secret. My throat went dry, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The gentle morning light suddenly felt harsh, illuminating these choices as if they were a sentence being passed down. At that moment, I realized my family wasn't in control anymore. We were being watched, and the decision about our fate was no longer ours. That evening, while Lisa was cleaning in the kitchen, she called me over, her voice trembling. In her hand was a small, yellowed scrap of paper, wrinkled with age, clearly hidden away in the back of a cabinet. The handwriting was hurried, jagged, almost frantic, as if scratched down in desperation. Always keep the doors locked. Don't step outside after dark. If you hear voices calling from the forest, leave immediately. Always keep the doors locked. Don't step outside after dark. If you hear voices calling from the forest, leave immediately. My heart pounded in my chest. We kept searching, and then behind the bathroom mirror, Lisa uncovered another note longer, the handwriting darker, jagged, almost carved into the page. Reading it made the air inside the cabin feel heavy, suffocating. On the second night, we were surrounded. There were people outside the doors, trying every handle, every window. They called to us, but it wasn't English. It wasn't any language we knew. It sounded like whispers, stretched out, layered over each other, getting closer and closer. The sounds inside the room shifted in that moment. The wind slipping through the cracks in the cabin no longer sounded like air. It felt like labored breathing. The creak of the wooden floor beneath my feet seemed sharper, faster, like a pulse I couldn't control. Lisa and I locked eyes, neither of us saying a word, but both knowing the truth. This cabin was not isolated the way the listing had promised. Someone, or more than one, had been here long before us, leaving warnings for whoever dared to stay. The next evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the last golden light stretched across the porch, Ashley suddenly shouted from outside. Her voice was caught between curiosity and fear. I rushed out and found her pointing at the wooden railing. Carved deep into the timber were straight marks, repeating over and over, grouped in clusters, broken up by strange symbols I'd never seen before. At first, they looked random, until I realized they lined up almost perfectly with the booking dates of the cabin on Airbnb. The kind of information only someone inside the system could know. A chill raced down my spine. These weren't scratches, and they weren't the product of time. They were records, proof that someone had been tracking every single guest who came here, not just for weeks, but for years, maybe decades. In that moment, the cabin itself seemed to change. The sunset cast long, jagged shadows across the porch, and the carvings darkened, resembling rough eyes staring straight at us. I could hear the stream nearby, but instead of the soothing melody it had offered on the first day, the sound now carried a cold rhythm, like whispers echoing just beneath the surface, reminding me that every step, every breath my family took was being monitored by something unseen. That Sunday night, as we set the table for dinner, Derek suddenly screamed. His voice was sharp, panicked. I sprinted over and saw him trembling, his finger pointing at the dining room window. For a split second, I saw it too. A face, pressed tightly against the glass, pale and still under the warm glow of the cabin lights. The eyes dark, unblinking, empty, were only inches away from my son's. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the figure melted back into the night. I threw the door open and stepped outside. The cold night air hit my face, carrying the damp, earthy smell of rotting leaves. I swept my flashlight across the cabin walls, and my pulse quickened. Smudged handprints covered the windows, streaking down the glass as if someone had pressed against it for hours, silently watching us. Beneath the flower bed, clear barefoot tracks were stamped deep into the wet soil, the toes splayed wide, calloused from years of walking across stone and dirt. When I turned back toward the windowsill, my throat tightened. Someone had left gifts. A crude wooden figure, carved into a distorted human shape, a basket woven from branches, stuffed with dry leaves, and worst of all, small animal remains, carefully arranged into a twisted pattern, like part of a ritual I couldn't begin to understand. The warm light spilling from inside the cabin fell across the objects, casting long, tangled shadows that crawled across the wall like grasping hands. In that instant, it was undeniable. We were not alone, and even more disturbing, they wanted us to know we weren't. The next day, while trying to clean up and calm the family, I started noticing more details inside the cabin itself. That's when it hit me. This place wasn't just a rental. It was a crossroads between two worlds. In the corner of an old cabinet, I found primitive tools, a rusted blade bound to a wooden handle, a small stone hammer worn smooth with use. On a kitchen shelf, hidden behind canned goods, were jars of preserved food, dried meat, wild berries, even strange herbs. None of it belonged to us. None of it matched the description in the rental listing. Looking deeper, I discovered markings scratched inside cupboards, under tables, and behind furniture. They matched the same patterns carved on the porch railing that Ashley had found. It was proof. The people out there had entered this cabin before, and more chillingly, they had established a way of communicating with previous guests. Some marks looked like symbols of agreement. Small objects were tucked away in drawers, like tokens exchanged. Slowly, I began to understand. Some families had chosen to cooperate, leaving behind supplies, staying silent in return for being allowed to leave safely. But not everyone had been that fortunate. In the dark corner of the living room, I found a child's backpack, the fabric green with mold. Inside were personal items, a wrinkled comic book, a tiny jacket. They didn't belong to any of us. The smell of mildew rose up like undeniable evidence someone had left this place in a hurry, or never had the chance to leave at all. At that moment, clouds drifted over the cabin, dimming the light. The air grew heavier, And I realized the fragile truth. The line between guest and owner here was almost non-existent. This cabin had long since become neutral ground, a place where outsiders were forced to negotiate with those who had never left these mountains. From the very moment I booked the cabin, I noticed a few strange reviews. Some guests mentioned feeling like they were being watched, and they warned others not to go outside at night. Honestly, I just laughed it off. I was born and raised in Tennessee, used to forests and mountain living. I'd hunted, camped for weeks at a time in places far more remote than this. To me, those warnings were nothing more than city folks being jumpy people who get spooked by darkness and the natural noises of the woods. In fact, I was excited. I believed this trip would finally show Lisa and the kids what life in the real outdoors was like. Quiet, clean, free from technology and the constant pressure of the city. I was confident I had the experience to keep my family safe. After all, how dangerous could a restored rental cabin really be? Especially one openly listed online. But looking back now, that confidence feels like walking into a pitch-black room with my eyes closed. I never realized that behind all that beauty and peace was a thick wall of darkness waiting for us. My name is Craig Morrison. My wife Lisa and I have 2 teenage kids, Ashley and Derek. In October 2022, we decided to spend a week completely off the grid. No phones, no social media, nothing pulling us away from each other. We wanted to reconnect as a family, and I couldn't imagine a better place than the Appalachian Mountains in autumn. The entire forest was painted in red, gold, and amber, with crisp air that seemed to wash away every bit of city noise. After days of searching, I chose a cabin on Airbnb. The listing promised total seclusion. No cell service, no television, just basic electricity and running water. To me, that was perfect, not too harsh, but remote enough to force us to really talk, to really connect. At the time, I was certain this would be the most memorable trip of our lives. What I didn't know was that the isolation we were chasing would open the door to an experience none of us would ever forget. That night, we slept in a kind of uneasy vigilance. I remember locking every window, every door, even wedging chairs against the front entrance. But when morning light slipped faintly through the curtains, I knew something was wrong. The front door's lock bore thin, precise scratches, the kind only a tool could leave. The window latches had been loosened, as if someone had tried them carefully, silently, without ever making a sound. When I stepped into the living room, I froze. Some of our belongings had been moved. The backpack I'd left in the corner was now dragged into the middle of the floor. A drawer I knew I'd shut was hanging open, its contents scattered. But what made my skin crawl wasn't the mess. It was the way everything had been rearranged. On the wooden table, our personal documents, IDs, driver's licenses, credit cards, even family photos were laid out in perfect rows, as if someone had spent hours studying them. And it didn't stop there. Every device we'd brought, the phones, the camera, even Derek's smartwatch, had been unplugged from their chargers and placed separately, like pieces of evidence collected for inspection. A chill spread up my spine. This wasn't just someone sneaking around outside. This was a calculated break-in, silent and precise, carried out while my entire family slept only a few feet away. And the worst part, none of us had heard a single sound. The next morning, I decided to circle the cabin, searching for more signs. The stream still ran gently nearby, sunlight glinting off the water, but inside, I felt an unease I couldn't shake. Just a few steps into the tree line, my stomach clenched. Hanging from a branch was an old plastic doll, its clothes shredded, its hair matted with dirt. Not far from it, a torn canvas tent flapped in the wind, shredded into strips and draped across branches like flags. As I pushed further, I found objects that were all too familiar but twisted into grotesque decorations. A flashlight snapped in half, bound with vines. A broken camera nailed to a tree trunk like a blind eye. Scattered children's toys arranged in a perfect circle, with stones stacked neatly in the center. I knew then this wasn't abandoned junk. These were signs, reminders. Not every guest who came here had left in peace. These things were keepsakes, taken or left behind, now turned into symbols of a hidden order only the forest's unseen inhabitants could understand. The wind shifted, spinning the doll slowly. Its lifeless plastic eyes seemed to lock onto mine. And in that moment, I understood. My family was only the latest in a long, unspoken list of visitors who had walked into this place. I also knew one thing for certain. If I chose to fight back, we'd stand no chance. Our car was sabotaged, the way out unclear, and whoever was out there, whoever or whatever, knew the land better than we ever could. They had patience. They had control. That night, after Lisa and the kids went to bed, I sat alone at the wooden table, my hands trembling as I wrote a few desperate lines on a scrap of paper. We don't mean any harm. We will leave. Please let my family be safe. It doesn't aid it. I folded the note and placed it alongside a few small offerings we'd brought with us, a pack of dried meat, a new folding knife, and a shiny metal lighter. I set them all on the windowsill, right where the strange gifts had been left for us before. That night, the wind howled through the cracks in the cabin like a long, endless hiss. I barely slept, straining to catch every sound. By dawn, I forced myself up to check the windowsill. The note was gone. The knife, the lighter, the dried meat, gone as well. In their place, etched neatly into the wood, was a fresh row of symbols. Ashley was the first to recognize them. They were identical to the markings carved into the porch railing we'd found earlier, but this time, lined up carefully, like an answer. I understood immediately. They had read the message, accepted the offerings, and chosen to respond. The speed, the precision, the order, it all proved something I hadn't wanted to admit. These weren't wandering shadows in the woods. This was a community, structured and disciplined, bound by their own code of conduct. And most importantly, they held absolute control over this land. In that moment, a strange mix of relief and dread hit me. Relief, because the silence had been broken, we weren't ignored. Dread, because it meant we weren't just being watched anymore. We were in the middle of a negotiation with an entire hidden society, one that played by rules far outside anything civilization could recognize. The next morning, as sunlight slipped into the cabin, Lisa let out a choked cry from the kitchen. I rushed over, and my heart dropped. Spread across the table was a stack of photographs, not ones we had brought, but images taken long ago, in places far from here. There was our house in the city, captured from multiple angles, my office building, the parking lot I walked across every day, and worse photos of Ashley and Derek, standing in front of their school. The shots were clear, sharp, printed with care. Not blurry glimpses, not accidents. These had been taken deliberately, as if someone had been tracking us for a long time. The entire cabin sank into a heavy silence. Even the air felt thick, pressing down on my chest. The photographs lay arranged in order, sending a message without words. We know who you are. We can reach you anywhere. And if you break the agreement of silence, there will be consequences. Outside the window, the Appalachian forest still glowed with autumn colors, leaves drifting gently in the breeze. But the view no longer carried any peace. To me, it was a curtain, and behind it, countless unseen eyes were watching every move my family made. Right then, we understood. Silence was our only choice. This wasn't a vacation anymore. This was an escape. And if we wanted to protect our children, we had to carry this secret home, never to speak of it again. Sitting in that quiet cabin, I began piecing everything together. The calloused footprints around the porch, the markings carved into wood like a calendar, the warning notes hidden in drawers, the break-in that left our documents and devices carefully displayed. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. This wasn't a group of drifters or lost wanderers living on the fringes. They had knowledge. They had order. They had a system. They knew how to disable a car with the precision of a trained mechanic. They understood the mechanics of locks, leaving messages without ever speaking a word. And they even held in their hands photographs of my home, my workplace, my children's school, things only people with knowledge of systems and deliberate channels of information could possibly acquire. In my head, one chilling truth echoed. This was a community, structured, disciplined, with rules. A society that had lived parallel to the modern world for years. They hadn't disappeared. They had simply pulled back into the shadows of Appalachia, quietly building their own order, monitoring every outsider who dared step into the territory they still considered their own. The thought made my spine turn cold, because it meant my family hadn't just stumbled across a few strange figures in the woods. We had crossed paths with an entire hidden society, one where every action was measured, every decision observed, and our safety depended entirely on following rules we barely understood. On our final night in the cabin, we hardly slept. Every gust of wind through the cracks, every snap of a branch outside, sent my heart racing. But when dawn broke, a strange stillness settled over the house. Stepping outside, I found the car restored, the tires full again, the hood closed tight as if it had never been pried open. Some parts even gleamed brighter than before, as though someone had quietly replaced them with new components while we slept. Along the ground, carved into trees and stones lining the path, were the familiar symbols. I recognized them instantly. A marked trail, the route we were permitted to follow, an approved way out of their land. No one spoke. Lisa held Ashley and Derek close in the back seat, her eyes fixed on the windows. I drove in silence, following the signs, every mile stretching into hours. The Appalachian forest blazed with autumn color, but to us, it was no longer beautiful. It was a curtain, and behind it, I could feel hundreds of unseen eyes watching. Finally, when a faint cell signal reappeared on the dashboard screen, I let myself exhale. We had escaped, but none of us spoke of reporting this to Airbnb or the police. The photographs of our house, my office, our children's school, burned in my memory. The warning was too clear. If we broke the silence, the consequences would follow us far beyond the woods. We left that cabin in absolute silence, carrying with us a secret no one dared to speak. And from that day forward, I've lived with the knowledge that there are places in Appalachia untouched by any modern map places, where laws aren't written by society, but by communities hidden for generations. Back in the city, life slowly returned to its routine work. School, bright lights, but in my mind, the memory of that week in the Appalachian Mountains remains carved as deeply as the marks on that cabin's porch. My family learned a bitter truth. Not every remote cabin listed online really belongs to its so-called legal owner. Many of these houses sit on land still claimed by communities that never left people who chose to live outside of modern society. And in that hidden world, the rules aren't written in contracts or backed by courts. They're carved into wood, whispered in notes left behind at night, and enforced by unseen eyes tracking every move of those who dare to stay. They alone decide who gets to remain and who is forced to leave. Their laws are invisible but absolute, requiring no police, no judge, only silence to survive. So if there's one warning I can give anyone tempted to book an isolated cabin in the Appalachians, it's this. Be careful. Don't trust the pretty photos or the glowing reviews, because in the thick darkness of those mountains, when you look out the window at night, the only reflection you should see staring back is your own. But sometimes you'll see more than that.